warm welcome to our studio guests today and to fellow travelers out in cyberspace, thanks to that non-stop stream of zeros and ones, as it were, the modern zero in search of its ancient forebears. My name is Peter Gobetz, co-founder of the Xero Project and moderator of the International Conference-/Workshop on Xero. The Xero Project is a three-stage affair. There's a book project, an associated online event, and then there's the in-depth research program to follow. But today, session number 6, and we welcome yet another contributor to the monograph on Xero book project, Professor Alexis Lavis, Philosophy and Cultural Studies, Renmin University of China in Beijing. Alexis will go to the heart of the Xero project's objective to consider whether or not the invention of Xero was facilitated by the then contemporaneous philosophy of emptiness, or shunyata. We welcome back as panelists today Dr. Marina Wiel, Eric Hoogkarstel, and Alexis, may I now invite you to briefly introduce yourself and to present the thrust of your paper, please.
Yes, thank you to Peter and all the people gathered in the very interesting Xero project that cost me many worries, because in the Buddhist field, well, we very often associate the interpretation of the Buddhist shunyata with the Xero, and in a certain way it's the reverse we should do. That is to say, interpreting the Xero number from the shunyata philosophy. I'm very glad to be here on this Xero project. I'm professor actually in Beijing, in Renmin. I come from France, and I made my PhD on Buddhist Sanskrit text, translated that, interpreting from Sanskrit to French. And so I was invited on the topic of the influence and the eventual influence of Buddhism on the invention and development of Xero. So what the great interest or contribution of the new dating for the Bachelorette manuscript was only for me to authorize to leave aside the question of knowing in which cultural zone the Xero found its origin. And we can assume now with much greater assurance that Xero is Indian by birth. So it was a good point for me to enclose a bit the question. And this new dating invites us to focus on the Indian cultural space to deepen our understanding of the philosophical or metaphysical conditions for the appearance of this strange mathematical object. This new dating so allows us to modify the question that would be no more, where does Xero come from? But why was this astonishing mathematical object born in India, and how can this birth and its condition be explained and determined? So the thesis, or if you want, the hypothesis, which is more correct, of my article was that Buddhism could very well be the philosophic field, or in a much more phenomenological way of speaking, the transcendental field from which the invention of the mathematical Xero makes sense. Buddhism might constitute an a priori framework of meaning favorable and even constitutive of the Indian Xero. That is to say, as it is used in the Bachelorette manuscripts, but also through its development in Brahmagupta's theory, for example. So Buddhism could be the philosophical field of birth and development of the mathematical and Indian Xero, also named Shunya. And I prefer to mention it. It was not in that article a question of proving this, but just of establishing more precisely the possibility of this influence. And our paper was organized in 7 parts. So first, Greco-Buddhist contexts of apparition of the Bachelorette manuscripts. Second, the difficulties for determining precisely a clear influence at work in these manuscripts. Third, well, assuming the prevalence of Buddhism influence in the region where these manuscripts were discovered. Fourth, how the philosophical field of Buddhism is favorable for the appearance of the zero. Five, the Mahayanist shunyata and the interpretation of shunya as number, the link, the philosophical link between them. Sixth, a development around shunyata as both understood as space open and pratitya samutpada, that is to say, something like an interactional game or a reciprocal process or operational dimension, which fits very good with mathematics. And seventh, establishing a more precise link between the work of Brahmagupta and Buddhism, because it's in the Brahmagupta's works that the real zero is real and deep form. So on that first moment, we should investigate a bit this Greco-Buddhist context of apparition of the Bachelorette manuscripts. We knew that it was in the Peshawar region, that is to say in the ancient Gandhara, that these manuscripts were founded. And this region was a real crossroads of commerce and civilization. So it was a really rich period, really rich region of cultural interactions and upheavals. And because of that, it caused many difficulties in researching a clear influence of this text, and hence of the origin of the zero. Another point that we must add, that in that region, despite these crossroads, multiple influences, the Greek and the Buddhist influence were surely the strongest. So taking that into account, now we must see the difficulties for determining a precise and clear influence at work in the Bachelorette manuscripts. First point, we must assume that that's a contemplative tradition, such as Buddhism, seems very far away from the mathematical concern present in the Bachelorette manuscripts. Second, the introductive and conclusive pages of the manuscript are missing. And these pages were devoted traditionally to the presentation of the author, and in these pages happens very traditionally something like a religious dedication. So we don't have that. And that is to say, we don't have explicit influence in this mentioned inside these Bachelorette manuscripts. The remaining pages only deal with arithmetics, giving a large number of problems associated with daily life that don't fit well with the higher dimension of the practices and reflections of Buddhism. And the very arithmetical and practical purpose of the manuscripts doesn't seem to require the aid or the influence of Buddhism. On the reverse part of the influence, that is to say the Greek one, well, the eventually Greek influence is neither explicit nor implicit in the Bachelorette manuscripts. The form and the style of these manuscripts are entirely Indian. And we must add to that this new dating makes the hypothesis of a direct Greek influence far more fragile. So why insisting for finding a Buddhist influence? Because this influence cannot be ignored, given its pervasiveness across the whole of the northwestern region, and also because of the development of the Indian zero, of which the Bachelorette manuscripts are first known evidence, and that could not have arisen from nowhere. It demands a philosophical basis, which Buddhism, more than any other movement, is likely to have supplied. So let's assume the prevalence of Buddhist influence in the region where and when these manuscripts of Bakhshali were discovered. So, of course, no explicit reference to Buddhism within the Bakhshali manuscripts, but they were produced in a region very strongly influenced by Buddhism. And this influence is maybe not inside the manuscripts, but surely surrounded them. The history of this Gandhara region during the time of the Bakhshali manuscripts showed the progressive hegemony of Buddhism on political side or political plan, cultural plan, and also scientific plan. Some aspects of this Gandharian version of Buddhism was very creative, very innovative, and very speculative. Was great provider of concepts, and especially in metaphysical order. This Buddhism, this Gandharian Buddhism, has a strong taste for logic and for the art of reasoning, which fits very well with mathematics. Other point, very important, in this Gandharian region was found many monasteries organized as universities or research centers, where not only Buddhism was taught, but also astronomy, grammar, and of course, mathematics. It was not only religious. These kind of separation are really Western in a certain way. So, how the philosophical field of Buddhism should be favorable for the appearance of the Zero? Maybe we should change the question. Given the obviously strong influence of Buddhism in this region and at the time of the Bakhshali manuscripts, how could it not have an influence of them? The question is therefore much more what is in this Buddhism influence and how to determine it, that was there an influence of Buddhism on Bakhshali manuscripts. With a great example, the researcher, very well-known, Rudolf Hörnler, had already established two similarities between the manuscripts and the Buddhist texts. The language, the metrics on one hand, but also the style of reasoning on the other hand. So maybe we should find another influence around precisely this invention of the Zero. So, as you already know, there is no zero, that is to say, O symbol found in the Bakhshali manuscripts for representing Shunya, but only a simple dot, that is to say, a bindu in Sanskrit. In the manuscripts, the zero dot does not have yet the stature of a number, as it will have, for example, in the Brahmasputta Siddhanta of Brahmagupta. But it is only a placemaker used to indicate an empty space or a hiatus. So the zero didn't mean just nothing in these manuscripts. That is to say, a pure deprivation of being, a pure non-being, but more subtly, it referred to a vacant space or place, which is not the same at all. And this relation between a kind of nothingness, a kind of note, if you want, and some kind of freedom or fundamental availability, that is to say, a vacancy. Well, and also the idea that the nothing could liberate something, that the nothing is a complementary face of the free, was here clearly established since the beginnings of Buddhism. For example, the notion of nirvana also relies on the same idea, since it signifies both extension and liberation at the same time. There is also the case of this major ancient Buddhist school named Sarvastivada, and this school of Sarvastivada was found in this Gandharian region, that is to say, where the manuscript of Bhaskali were found. This school of Buddhism, Sarvastivada, excuse me, determine what the shunyata, that is to say, the vacancy. I prefer translating shunyata by vacancy and not by emptiness for metaphysical reason. So this shunyata does not in any way prevent the existence of reality, but in some way established it. It's a very fertile conception of nothingness, not a conception of nothingness which should be opposed radically to being. It is because shunyata was considered from the idea of an empty place, that is to say, from the idea of availability, and not from a pure note or non-existence, that there is no contradiction in affirming both vacancy and existence, and that the first may precede the later. And the use of zero as placeholder, as well as the fact that it can symbolize the unknown in an equation, as it is used perfectly in the Bhaskali manuscripts, agrees entirely with the metaphysics of the Sarvastivada, and even to the point of being its most simple mathematical application. Other point interesting of correspondence, the use of a dot, that is to say the bindu, as a symbol for zero. And it was also used by the Sarvastivadian thinkers for symbolizing the most elementary entity of reality, named Kshana, which could be understood as atom of time, and which was understood as a position of termination and initializing both, as it is used as the use of the zero as placeholder in the decimal scheme in use in the Bhaskali manuscripts. So it's conveyed totally. Another very interesting correspondence between Bhaskali manuscripts and Buddhist texts, according to the Sarvastivadian school, the passage from nothing to something, that is to say, in mathematics, from 0 to 1, was named rupa by the Sarvastivadi, and the figure 1 was also named rupa in the Bhaskali manuscripts. Very interesting correspondence. So another important moment for establishing this influence is to see how the conception of shunyata should serve as a basis for the interpretation of shunya as a number. I would like to promote the idea that the influence of Buddhism on zero was not only possible at the beginning, that is to say, only during the Bhaskali manuscript time, but also accompanied the development of it in the work of Brahmagupta, for example. What an example. Brahmagupta's works so developed many points from the elements present in the Bhaskali manuscripts, among which the zero rightly stands out, moving from a strictly positional statue to one which was much more operative and philosophically deeper, that is to say, of a number. In parallel, it was the notion of shunyata which would experience significant conceptual development with the advent of the Mahayana, whose kinship with the Sarvastivada school is fully acknowledged. So we see a correspondence between Buddhism and mathematics developments, which both take place around the same notion of shunya. It's interesting to see how Buddhism, and particularly Mahayana, could become the philosophical field for the invention of the number zero, as it is found in exemplary form in Brahmagupta. And reversely, the Greek philosophical field was totally unsuitable for the development of the mathematical zero. The introduction of the Arabic zero during the end of the Middle Age in the West, this Middle Age was very Aristotelian, was so difficult and occurred so many prohibitions because the philosophical field was not good enough for the apparition of the mathematical zero. We can only be amazed, given the problem encountered in the West, at the ease with which Brahmagupta introduced the number zero into his work, and with almost no introduction in the way of evidence, showed how this number behaved in various operations. Nowhere in the Brahmasputa Siddhanta is there the least reluctance, hesitation, or awkwardness in the chapter about Shunya, or even any in-depth explanation about the fact that he gave it the stature of a number. Let us once more note that it cannot be taken for granted that nothing can be operative. However, since Brahmagupta does indeed do this, there must be some prior conditions making it acceptable, conditions which indeed are found together in Mahayanic Buddhism. So let's see this Buddhist interpretation of Shunyata, and more specifically the Mahayanic interpretation of Shunyata, which is more structured in a certain way, more in deep. And let's see how this interpretation fits with this promotion of Shunya as a number, an operative being in mathematics. So the word first, it's very important to notice that the word Shunya already existed before its mathematical use. So it is not then the figure, the symbol, which gives the meaning to the word, but the word which indicates the significance of the symbol, or the mathematical symbol, or the mathematical figure. Brahmagupta so defined the zero, firstly, not from its value and mathematical role, but from what the common notion of Shunya evokes to him. So he speaks of space, of openness, and even of the vault of heaven. And these images were also in a number of Mahayanic texts, Buddhist texts, used to describe either the nature and the experience of Shunyata. The idea of openness, of free space, appear also in the etymology of the word Shunya itself, whose Indo-European roots relates, for example, to the Greek quar, which means openness, referring especially to the ears or needles. And it's very interesting because nowhere in the Greek mathematics you have something like the word quar. So the symbol zero, like that is the shape of a hole or of an opening, represents this idea inside the words very well. And it's another argument in favor of the Indian origin of the symbol. The Mahayanists, and especially Nagarjuna, also produced a very original interpretation of Shunyata meaning. Absolutely not from nothingness, that is to say deprivation of being, but from the idea of interaction and reciprocal operativity. And it fits perfectly with the use of Shunya as a number. So let's see more closely this relation between Brahmagupta and Buddhism. Although even Brahmagupta was certainly not a Buddhist, we know that. He lived in a place and at a time when there was indisputably a strong Buddhist presence, and at a time when Buddhist thinking was becoming more and more logical and epistemological. has no need to be Buddhist to feel its influence, just as Euclid didn't need to be a member of the Platonic Academy to be influenced by Platonic metaphysics. Buddhism has then become a part of the ambience, of the mood of Indian thoughts. And this factor, without doubt, opened up a possibility of an operative use of zero. And to express it in a Kantian form, we should say, Buddhist thinking about shunyata provides the condition of possibility for the mathematical shunyata. In other words, to make it thinkable. And more phenomenologically, because I come from phenomenology, I should say that Buddhist conception of shunyata constitutes a very favorable transcendental field, both for the origin and also the development of the mathematical shunyata. That is to say, from the Bachelorette manuscripts, from the Brahma Sputa Siddhanta of Brahmagupta. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very, very much, Alexis. I personally am very much enamored of the flow of the argument, building to this climax where you make it virtually impossible for zero not to have been invented during that particular epoch. But that's neither here nor there at this stage. We leave the penetrating questions and comments to our two panelists. I would invite Marina first, if you have any questions or comments for Alexis.
Well, first, thank you very much for this introduction to this really exciting cultural era. So I have two small comments. First, you didn't have time to mention it now, but in your paper you explained that this sort of zero shunya was also used to denote the unknown in an equation.
Yeah.
And like in the West, until Descartes, up to Descartes' teacher Clavius, the unknown was called res, a thing. So do you see between the unknown being this vacancy or being called a thing, do you see a correspondence with these philosophical differences which you have outlined? And my second comment is, I think you made a very, very convincing case for the fact that to understand the development of math and probably of other sciences, you need to know the philosophical background. So what would there be? Would you have any idea of how we would go about doing that? Maybe for geometry, for the idea about space, which is probably also cultural. So, but anyway, thank you. It was really exciting.
I'm sorry, but it was difficult to hear the last part of your intervention. Do you mention geometry? That's right.
Right. I said you really were very convincing in your thesis, and I think it really makes sense that to understand the development of mathematics, you need to know the cultural, philosophical, or maybe anthropological background. And so what would be, how would we go about doing a similar analysis for, not for numbers, but for space, for geometry? Why did you? So
it's
do you have any comments about that?
It's an amazing question, because the field for what should be named Indian geometry, because geometry is a Greek name, so it means something in Greek. It's always difficult to borrow foreign terms because you borrow a world. But the field for the science of space, if you want, I'm not sure it could be Buddhism, because
No, it's Brahmanism.
yeah,
It's derived from the art of making the altar. It's in the Vedas already.
of course, it's totally ritual. It comes from the ritualistic mind of India. So it was how to build mandalas or of altar or something like that. So it's not the same field. And for example, the interpretation of the meaning of rituals in Buddhism is totally revolutionary in a certain way, very, very bizarre for the Indian mind. So always remember that Buddhism was not so natural for Indian normal way of thinking. And it's very interesting because the experience of space, because the vocabulary in Buddhist text around space and spacey dimension is very flourishing. Many vocabularies around the space experience, but it's only an experience. That is to say, it's a pure phenomenological way of describing a meditative state. So it's not a good basis for geometry. There is no metron. There is no measure. The problem is the metron, the Greek metron, that is to say, the measure. And the Buddhist experience of space is beyond any kind of measure. It's entirely phenomenological. So it should work for arithmetics, but not for geometry. But that field, we have only hypothesis. There is no proof at all.
Of course, yeah.
We are not talking about any kind of causality. We are talking about just a way of describing and how to understand a phenomenon named a number like 0. And you can describe from what? Because, of course, any kind of mathematical objects, they are not coming from nowhere.
Right.
That's why it was very important. It's very methodological, but they are using the word shunya, and the word shunya was used before the number 0. A meaning, there is a meaning in that concept or that notion beyond any kind of conceptual evolution. And it's very interesting because this notion of shunya, etymologically talking, means that. It means that. That is to say, the whole of the year. So it's exactly the form of the symbol.
Marina, does that answer your question? Or would you have a follow-up question?
Yes, it opens much food for thought. Thank you. Yes.
Derek, your turn, please. If you take.
Well, first, thank you for your interesting speech. I will start with a small remark. You said any mathematical object has to come from somewhere, but I remember having read Anthropologie structurale written by Claude Lévi-Strauss, and he made a case for being several objects, mathematical objects, other objects, could be invented in different places in the world and different times of history. One of my main problems with your speech is your focus on the Gandharan region. Kandahar, or Kandahar, it's known today, was indeed a very lively place, but it was the place of the Sarvastivadins, which were very close to Parmenides, if you want. They were ontologists. They were very keen on the Abhidharma, which is an ontological philosophy and has been made ridiculized by Nagarjuna himself. Nagarjuna was not an inhabitant of Gandhara. He is placed by most experts in the region of Andhra Pradesh, together with Dignaga a few centuries later. Moreover, Nagarjuna was not an adherent of Mahayana Buddhism. You don't find any mentioning of bodhisattvas, rituals, or whatever. He cherishes the 4 special persons. To him, the Arhat is the highest. He calls himself a Patriarcha Buddha, so there's no trace of any Mahayanic thought, nor in Dignaga, for that matter, who was the most famous Buddhist logician. Kandahar was the place of first the Sarvastivadins, which were ontologists, and later the place where Asanga and Vasubandhu lived, who went from Sarvastivadin Buddhism to Yogacara. And Yogacara philosophy is a total ontological mess. They said that every reality depends on cognition or consciousness, if you follow Paramartha. But that the real world can only be perceived by the true Buddha, which means that it must exist, which is again a kind of metaphysical ontology. And what Nagarjuna does is rejecting all kind of metaphysical thought, because everything is correlative, pratitya samutpada, and therefore it is shunya. Shunya doesn't mean nothing, it doesn't mean absence, it's just the fact that there is no substance, svabhava shunyata. So it is a thought, no, I rephrase, it is a phenomenological description of a meditation experience which is very, very far away from the concept of mathematical concept of shunyata. Maybe you could say it's a kind of metaphor, but it is very hard to say that it made the environment which was suitable for the development of the mathematical trick, which is called the zero.
Erik, thank you. Alexis, do you want to respond to that?
Oh yeah, of course. There are many things to say, because when I focused on the relationship between Buddhism and the Bakhshali manuscripts, I only mentioned this first form of Buddhism, small vehicles Buddhism, that is to say, just around the Sarvastivadin way of thinking, and there are absolutely no influence of Mahayanic way of thinking in the Bakhshali manuscript. It's strictly impossible, and I say that. I cut my paper in a certain way in two. The Mahayanic influence could be interesting only for studying a bit this ground, only for Brahmagupta, not from the Bakhshali manuscripts. And the point is that the region where Brahmagupta lived, that is to say around Ujjain, near Mathura, the great center, were fully and entirely influenced by Mahayanic Buddhism at that time, because he was born in the 6th century. So in the 6th century, all the great Mahayanist schools were fully now, in a certain way. Buddhism was waiting for tantric Buddhism only. And so the landscape, if you want.
What is your evidence that in the 6th century there was a large Mahayanic influence? Because there's very little evidence.
Because of the set. Because in archaeology, for example, there are many temples, because it was the time of Harsha Emperor, that is to say, one of the last great Buddhist emperor, and because of the texts. We have these texts during that period. We have many great influenced Mahayanic texts in that period that were not published but written. So Paramartha, for example, Paramartha was born in Ujjain, that is to say the same region of Brahmagupta, and he was born 100 years before Brahmagupta, in the same city. And Paramartha, you mentioned it. So it's thinkable, of course, no proof, but it's totally thinkable to assume that yes, the Mahayanic way of thinking was present. And after that, we have to be very cautious by using this notion of ontology and even metaphysics, because, as you know,
hey, come on, sarva asti varnes, sarva asti, everything is. What
Yes,
could be
but
more ontologistic?
No, but if you are reading closely the text, and if you are formed with Aristotle, it's not ontology at all, because all their philosophy of time, for example, is both being and non-being at the same moment. So what an ontology? An ontology that assumes contradiction in the most elemental dimension of reality. So it's impossible, ontologically talking, that is to say, for the Western way of thinking. So the notion of ontology, that is to say, thought from the Greek notion of onta, it's not so easy.
Gentlemen, if I may just interrupt for a second. You have both made a great contribution to the thrust of the Xero project, which is, our focus. We're not going to settle these issues that you are both raising now, absolutely. But what we can do is that you've both focused attention on a historical epoch and a geographical region that would serve very well for follow-up research to be done, to be able to see whether we can relate any of this to the invention of Xero. We're not going to settle that now, and that's not the object. The object is that we are working towards in-depth research down the line to be able to shed more light on this invention of Xero or otherwise. So we're not going to settle that. I think we would, introduce another session to be able to battle this out, because it's becoming very, very interesting. But for right now, and for the purpose of this event, I would like to thank you both very much for your contributions. It's been really very productive. We will continue after the recording with a little bit of further discussion, but for right now, unless there's something very, very pertinent that either of you would like to conclude with, I give you all three actually an opportunity. Let's go again with Marina first. After having heard this, any other comments or questions? Marina?
Well, I think it really makes one. Yes, no, just a very very interesting. No, I have no more comments. Just that I was really interested, and I would like to, as I said, it gives really food for thought about mathematical concepts. Are they what is a part of culture? What is Poincaré used to say that the notion of a group is something like, since we're among philosophers, I'm not, but still, it was in a priori of in the sense of Kant, and a priori of our form of consciousness. So that means it's totally not cultural. It's completely wired in our brain. So I think there's this tension. What is, as you said the first time, does Xero exist? Does it exist? Is it discovered, invented? But this gives amazing food for thought for that kind of question.
So what you're saying is that in your field of study, which is what was it again? Differential geometry or projective geometry. It seems to you, from what you've heard, that there is definite relevance to your field.
No, I'm saying the questions which have been raised about numbers, how you need a philosophical a background for certain concepts to emerge, and that other philosophical backgrounds are not conducive for these to emerge. Then it begs the question: what about space? Are there similar questions about space? Why does geometry emerge more here than there because of philosophical conditions? But I have absolutely no answer. And I'm saying there's the opposite idea that, like Poincaré, that some of the things are really wired in our brain. So they don't depend on the cultural context.
Well, there's another research question in another direction that we will pursue later on. Eric, any final comments?
Well, part of this research is historical, and then we bump into the strange mixture of myth and history that we find in Indian literature, and we also could find in ancient Greek literature, which makes it very difficult to find anything decisive.
Right. So we will have to see then in the actual research whether anything cogent will surface in the process of that or not. You know, it could be a dead end. On the other hand, it could open up a new vein of research. Alexis, your final word for you as our special guest today.
Oh yeah, I'm not very good for making conclusion. But it was just very interesting to work on this mathematical field, which is not. I studied logic a lot in Paris, so I was a bit keen with that, but not so much. And well, it's always interesting to of course, to speak about influence. That word influence is very vague, but maybe we should keep that word in this vagueness. That is to say, an influence is something that works from inside. So it's always difficult to cut, frankly, what happens to determine things. But yes, I think that's the hypothesis of a Buddhist influence of on the origin, on the something like philosophical origin of the mathematical use of shunya seems really possible indeed.
Thank you, Alexis. All the others have gone through this drill, but we generally conclude this session with 3 questions as a form of a survey. Very quick, one-liners, no elaboration. First of all, what do you think, Alexis? Was the numeral 0 discovered or invented?
Could you repeat the question, because it was difficult to hear you ask?
The numeral 0 as opposed to the placeholder 0, was the numeral 0, was it discovered or invented?
Discovered or invented by Brahmagupta. That's the point. Yes.
Well, we don't know if it was Brahmagupta or somebody else, but there was no 0 as a numeral, and then suddenly there wasn't 0 as a numeral, and we just want to determine whether it was a slow evolutionary process or whether it was a disruptive moment in history.
Oh, maybe it's both, because but it seems that if we are just reading the text, that this moment of really assuming that shunya is a number was something like a step, a jump.
Yeah.
And this jump was made by Brahmagupta.
Well,
yes.
That we don't. Okay, okay, that's fine. That actually is both questions 1 and 2 in together. And then finally, I think is pretty obvious from your presentation, but finally, is the concept of emptiness, is it trivial or profound?
The concept of emptiness is trivial or profound?
Or profound, yeah.
But in Buddhism or in mathematics?
Well, generally speaking.
Generally speaking, it's amazingly profound.
Okay, thank you.
It's amazingly profound, of course.
Okay, that's fine. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Sorry for having tried your patience, if I have. Please, now I'm speaking again. Where all the time the audience hopefully was watching, and so we're addressing the audience now. Please tune in the week after next to explore related issues, to pinpoint, if possible, the epicenter of Xero, because that's, of course, the objective. And in doing so, you'll be helping us to draft a roadmap for further research. Thank you for joining us today. Until next week, when we meet Professor Beatrice Lumpkin and Professor Anupam Jain. on respectively 0 in ancient Egypt and 0 in the ancient Jaina tradition in India. Thank you again. Until then.